Hello, my confirmation friends. Thanks for joining me again for another lesson. Today, our focus is going to be on the beginning of the historical books. In the last few lessons, we talked about the Israelites being freed from Egypt, moving out into the wilderness, wandering through the wilderness as God taught them how to be God's chosen people, laying out all of the rules for them to live in a way that will be abundant for everyone who is part of the people of Israel. And then now we have reached the promised land. So in our story today, we're talking about moving into the promised land. Now there's four main groups of books in the Old Testament. There's the Pentateuch, or the Torah, that we've been talking about. Sometimes it's called the Book of Law. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those have been the books that we've been covering so far, with the different stories that are in there, but also the different laws and teachings that God had for the people of Israel, for God's chosen people. In our lesson today, we are moving into the historical books. There's also the poetry books and the prophet books. We'll get into the prophets in a couple lessons down the road. But our historical books are the books that are called Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. And these are books that tell more of a historical look at the people of Israel and their story in this time period. But these aren't quite like history books like we would expect from reading in school today, because these history books, while they're history books telling the story, they also include songs, liturgies, hero legends, administrative lists, confections, and folk tales. Even within the historical books, there's a bunch of different literary styles that we find as we read through. The historical books that we're focusing on today are the Joshua and Judges, the first 2 of the historical books. In Joshua and Judges are when the people of Israel are getting settled in the land of Canaan, in the promised land, and they're adjusting to their new life. So Joshua and Judges were both written about 7th century, 6th century BCE. Some of their texts are even older than that, back to the 11th century. But it was by the 6th century that the books were compiled into a complete story. So we start off with Joshua, and Joshua is the beginning of the entry into the promised land, a beginning of the entry into Canaan. As they're entering into Canaan, there were already people who were there. And so the people of Israel, God's chosen ones, the partner people, they needed to conquer and conquest this land. So there is some battles that take place. There is destruction of some of the Canaan things that were in this land already. The reason for this destruction was because the Canaanites worshipped a different god. And so our God, the living God, didn't want there to be any temptations of religious items from the Canaanites to tempt the chosen people, God's partner people, into worshiping a different god. So the partner people, the people of Israel, start moving into the land of Canaan. They start moving into the promised land and settling in their new lives as God's chosen people. This is the fulfillment, the completion of God's promise from Genesis 12. God's promise that Abraham would be the father of all nations and that his people would have their own chosen, given land. So this is God's promises coming true. The story of Joshua and Judges gives us God's faithfulness and presence among God's chosen people. It also emphasizes covenant loyalty, asking the partner people, God's chosen people, to remain in that covenant that we've been talking about. The covenant where God will choose the partner people and the partner people will choose God and live in the way that God would like for them to live, with abundance for all, taking care of everybody in their community. And the other thing that's really emphasized is passing on the faith, telling stories and teaching the next generation about their history and about how God delivered them from the land of Egypt into the promised land, so that this legacy, this story, and this relationship with God can continue on in the next generations and doesn't end here. In the book of Judges, we see a little bit more decline and a little bit more internal dissension, a little bit more arguing between the partner people. Joshua, who has been the leader throughout the beginning of their time in the land of Canaan. He dies and passes on his leadership to Samuel. Samuel is born in the book of Judges and begins to rule. Now God has set up the people in the land of Canaan, the promised land, to have a system where there are judges. And the judges are leaders who are in charge of reminding people to follow God's laws, reminding people to live in ways that are abundant. But these judges are also just humans. So the judges also live lives that really they keep messing up. They forget themselves to live by God's own rules, even though they're reminding people of the rules that God set for them to live in the promised land. So Israel is having a hard time living by this covenant and beginning to argue with each other. And by the end of the book of Judges, we see that there is a need for centralized leadership, and people start asking for a king. This asking for a king will come in our next lesson, where Israel moves from having a decentralized leadership, a structure that allows for each person to not be above or below another, and starts moving towards the need to have a king to rule over the people of Israel. We'll talk about that more in our next lesson. Thank you all for joining me. We'll see you next time.